Well, we're going to start here this morning. A lot of weeks when I prepare this, I'm often wondering about, am I going to have enough material um, am I going to have enough material to make it through an hour? And usually, by the time I get here and start doing my final slide order and that type of thing, I realize that, yeah, I do have enough material for an hour. This week, I'm going to go through some things rather quickly, maybe from a little bit different perspective than some people have, but things have changed. The world has changed. The world is changing. The world is going to continue to change. And we talk about all these things as we get closer and closer to really ultimately the second coming of the Lord and the setting up of his millennial kingdom and the defeat of all the opposition and the defeat of the Antichrist and the false prophet and Satan being chained. And as these things converge and get closer and closer together, there's like a turbulence as these things accelerate. It's almost like a vortex in a tornado. And as you get closer into the center of the tornado, everything gets the wind gets stronger, there's more turbulence and that type of thing. And I really think that's a sort of a picture of where this thing is going for the end times. Now, I just want to recap what we did last week. Last week, one of the things I tried to do at the end was to just sort of put into context for you something that I think there's misconceptions about when is the time of Jacob's trouble. And I think as I established for you as we went through, we looked at the passage in Daniel chapter 9 about the 70 weeks and what's going to happen here in this final week known as Daniel's 70th week. We know that there's certain events that are marked out in Scripture as to what's going to happen. For example, we know that there's a coming world leader, and there's in Revelation chapter 5, it makes reference to this scroll. They look who's worthy to open the scroll, and there's only one, that's the Lamb, looked as it had been slain. And so this scroll is open, and as this scroll is open, what I personally believe is what happens is there's a progressive unfolding of these events of the end times. I think a lot of the foundational parts of these events are already in place. For example, let me use this example. We know that there's a great falling away, a great apostasy that's coming to the church. We know that at a certain point in that 70th week, it will be absolutely overwhelming, and the deception will be so great. But the deception is not going to appear overnight. It's going to be well in progress. I've always compared it. I talked to a fairly well-known Bible prophecy teacher about this once, and he didn't say I was crazy, so I can't say that he agreed with me, but he said, yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it. And I think of it as a bucket. When we were in college, one of the things that other guys like to do in our dorm was to take these large waste buckets, fill them almost to the top with water, lean them against somebody's door, and knock on the door and run away. Now we would we'd have a camera there and it'd be on YouTube, but so everybody could enjoy this. And as I said, the other guys did this, and but when they opened the door, of course, the bucket tipped over, and it was like a small tsunami hit their room, especially when you had tile floor and everything. And it was a great picture of the end times. It's also a way to get in a little bit of trouble, but that's the way it's going to be with the apostasy. The apostasy doesn't just come all of a sudden. It's going to build and build and build, and then it'll overflow and it'll be here. I think it's the same way as these seals are open in Revelation, as the first seal, the second seal. I think it's a progressive unveiling of the Antichrist. It may very well be that the confirmation of the covenant is not something that we know sufficient enough information about that we can identify the Antichrist from that. Now, it's very possible, politicians have egos and they'll want to say there's peace. But Jesus also said there will be many Antichrists in the world. So there might be many peace agreements. Now, I personally think that the peace agreement, the covenant that gets confirmed, are the Oslo Accords. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end today. But it may be that, there's a lot of things that go on in the world that the politicians don't really reveal to us. Can we agree on that? So it may be possible that this confirmation of the covenant may take place, and it may not be a public event like everybody assumes. It could be, but it may not be. So we may not have, so what I think happens though is, as you look at these progression of the seals, we know that the ultimate way, really I think the correct biblical way to identify the Antichrist, will be the one who goes into the temple of God, takes a seat, and declares himself to be above all that is called God. That will be, there's different views as to who that is. Is he European? Is he American? Is America Babylon? Is old Babylon Babylon? Is it an Islamic Antichrist? And people say, well, a good Muslim would never go into the temple of God and declare himself to be God. And my response to that is, who said he was a good Muslim? This guy's possessed by Satan. So all bets are off when this guy comes on the scene. He'll do things and say things and have an ego that is unmatched. He will be, in my view, detached from the rest of humanity. He will be egocentric. So I'm just saying I'm not saying everybody's wrong about everything that they have. I'm just saying you need to think about these things in a little bit more detail. Think through the implications of what you think. So what I think that happens with these seals is that as they progress, that there's this unveiling of the Antichrist that we know when he'll be able to be identified. It's possible, I think, the faithful of God that are present at the time will be able to identify him. But certainly by the midpoint, when he does that, then everybody should know, if they've read the scriptures and paid attention, but a lot of people will be deceived. So Jesus, when he talked about this, he referenced Daniel, the passage of Daniel chapter 9. When you therefore see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. Whoso readeth, let him understand. So Jesus says, look, go read Daniel. Understand what Daniel says. In Matthew chapter 24, then he continues in verse 21. So the Antichrist goes into the temple. We know that that's in the middle of the week. That's what Daniel tells us. And so when it happens in Matthew 21, it says what? For then shall be what? Great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. And then the parallel passage, though, about the time of Jacob's trouble, now we say Jesus said, great tribulation, such as what? Never was, nor ever will be. It's a unique period of time in human history, in the history of Israel, such as was not from the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be. So over in Jeremiah 30, though, he talks about, or the prophet Jeremiah talks about what's coming in this time of Jacob's trouble. For lo, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will bring again the captivity of my people Israel and Judah, saith the Lord, and I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. And these are the words of the Lord spake concerning Israel and concerning Judah. For thus said the Lord, we have heard a voice of trembling, of fear, and not of peace. Ask ye now, and see whether a man doth travail with child. Wherefore I do see every man with his hands on his loins as a woman in travail, and all faces are turned into paleness. Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. So that's where I get my conclusion that the Great Tribulation, which starts at the midpoint of the 70th week, and it may start immediately, it may be a little bit of a time lag, but sometime that Great Tribulation will be in that last half of the 70th week. We know that the reign of the Antichrist is identified as a time times and half a times. 360 plus 360 plus 360 plus 180, 1,260 days. 3.5 biblical years. That's what Daniel says. It identifies him as the reign of the Antichrist. So I think that this Great Tribulation and the time of Jacob's trouble are the same thing. Other people expand that Great Tribulation and the time of Jacob's trouble out to the entire 70th week, and I don't think that that's a correct interpretation of what the Scripture actually says. Writer this week in the Jerusalem Post said this: has World War III begun? And her conclusion is, it sure looks like it. And she also has he also has a conclusion that, maybe war's not the way to end all this. But we know what Scripture says. There will be wars, rumors of wars, and there's going to be there's a whole series of wars that are identified in the prophetic Scriptures. Now, one of the things we talked about just a little bit ago was apostasy in the church. And this is one of the most indicative indicators of the end times, this growing apostasy in the church. I got an email from someone this week, or a message, that said, hey, I went to the National Youth Workers Convention in Louisville, Kentucky. It took place last weekend. And here was their brochure: be inspired, be equipped, be focused, be recharged, be prepared, beyond. Explore what's next in youth ministry. So one of the things that in the past that has been a focus of the National Youth Workers Convention has been soul care. Now, we've talked a lot about that here. I don't have time to go into it. Spiritual formation, mysticism, and all these things that are wrapped up into it, psychology, and that type of thing. This is going on at National Youth Workers Convention. It's going on at Catalyst conferences. They're put on by Andy Stanley's group. I can show you evangelical churches in the Grace Brethren Fellowship that use labyrinths. I can get on Google Earth and I can show you one in California that has one in their courtyard. This stuff is everywhere, and that's what was one of the things that they were doing. Someone made up this slide, a man named Mark, made up this slide from what happened in 2014 in their sanctuary aspect of the National Youth Workers Conference. Lauds, Catholic morning prayer, transformation through spiritual formation, Stations of the Cross, imaginative prayer, Compline, which is a Catholic evening prayer, Visio Divina, icon contemplation, Breathing 101, breath prayers and meditation, Lectio Divina, labyrinth prayer walk, praying the hours, another Catholic. These Catholic practices adopted wholesale into youth specialties, National Youth Workers Convention, that thousands of evangelical youth pastors go to get trained. Do you think this is a problem? And I would encourage people that we don't have this problem here because we just have a small youth group, just got started, we're a new church. We will never, ever send our youth leaders to this kind of nonsense. It will not happen here. And people need to confront their church leadership as to why they're sending their people to this conference. Here's a picture of the sanctuary. This is from last year's conference. You see the Catholic aspect of this, the candles, the stained glass, and everything. Now, one of the things that this person who wrote to me told me about was what was said by Tony Campolo. Tony Campolo blogs at redletterchristians.org. He's a professor emeritus of sociology at Eastern University. He's an associate pastor in West Philadelphia. And he describes in his bio that he gave them to put is Tony Campolo is an activist and author of nearly 40 books. He has come out in support of gay marriage. By the way, I also read this week that the pastor of Mars Hill Church, Kent Dobson, said he's resigning. He's the one who, I think Rob Bell was replaced by Shane Hips, who was then replaced by Kent Dobson. I may have that wrong. I know Shane Hips was a teaching pastor there for a while. He resigned. He just said, my heart's not in being a pastor anymore, and that's fine. But in the interview where he talked about this, he said, I've always been affirming and I always will be affirming. What do you mean? He was affirming of gay marriage. The church there is apostate. It is totally gone. It was gone under Rob Bell, and yet people held Rob Bell up. He's at all these conferences at Willow Creek now, and now if you watch the spirituality stuff he's doing on the Oprah Network, he ended up where everybody knew that was discerning knew he would. But yet there were evangelical leader and group after leader that supported this guy. So they replaced him. And everybody said, well, they were uncomfortable with his position on gay marriage. Because he came out shortly, I think, after he left and said, yeah, I'm in support of it. Personally, wasn't surprised a bit. Wrote a book where he said he didn't believe in hell. Personally, not surprised a bit, because if you listen to that guy with a discerning spirit and with the scriptures in your hand, you would know that that's where he was going to end up. Tony Campolo resisted the affirming gay marriage thing for a long time. His wife supported it for a long time. He finally came out and said, doesn't make any difference. But what he gave in his talk, which was a biblical case for multiculturalism, okay? He titled his talk, A Biblical Case for Multiculturalism. And here's what the person said. I'm going to get the tape should be released. The tapes and videos should be released this week. I intend to get this one at least. Don't want to pay for it, but I will. He said this. This is a paraphrase of what he said. If a terrorist comes to you, holds a gun to your head, and wants you to say the Muslim Shahada, there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, he said, it's okay to pray the Shahada if there's a guy with a gun to your head, because Allah is just another name for God. And Muhammad is a prophet, and Jesus is a prophet, and while he was the Son of God, Muhammad did some good things also. So, what can we say? Apostate? No question. So, here's a good rule of thumb. If you're an evangelical and you see him invited to a conference, don't go. If you're there and you realize it, run away. If you're in Louisville, go to Churchill Downs. Watch the ponies or something. I don't know. It'd be better off use of your time than to listen to this nonsense. This is what National Youth Workers Convention is pushing. Apostasy in the church, big sign of the end times. Things have changed. 40 years ago, would this stuff have been allowed or tolerated? No, it wouldn't have been. Something happened in the meantime, though. I don't know exactly when the tipping point was, but the fights that they had about inerrancy 100 years ago, we're having again. We haven't learned. The liberal churches went off into social justice and social work, happening again. Nothing has changed. Well, it has changed. It seemed to be okay by and large for a while, but got away from the Word of God. I don't have time to talk about the economy. I really want to do an update some week when we talk about this a little bit, but what you're finding right now is that global debt default's near a milestone for corporations. Corporations all over the world are defaulting on their debt. Another thing that you see happening in economic is costs mount for student program. This was in the paper, Wall Street Journal the other day. I think in the Wall Street Journal Europe. So what's happening? They started this program to allow students to borrow money to go to college. Okay, everybody should go to college, so let's help them borrow money. So what did they do? They let everybody borrow money who could borrow money. And guess what happened? Well, the first thing that happened is the cost of college went through the roof. Big surprise. Government funds something and the cost goes up. I don't understand how that happened. Maybe some economists can explain to me the common sense notion that, yes, that's exactly what's going to happen. And so now what's happening is they're giving these debt forgiveness programs to students who do some kind of good social work for a year or two. They can get their debt forgiven. So guess what? Everybody's doing that, and what's happening? The defaults are just piling up in that program. Well over $1 trillion in outstanding student debt here. Another thing that may be related to the end times is, this was in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, trouble in the checkout line, which way to pay. If you've gone to the store recently, if you, by the way, have you seen some of the pictures of what the people were doing at these malls and stores and fighting over a $300 TV? I mean, seriously, one of the newspapers in The Independent, I think it was, in the UK, they put up the pictures of the American animals, subhumans that were out there fighting over this junk. And then they had a picture of the British who had their own Black Friday this year. And they opened the store and they're passing out crumpets and little snacks and that type of thing. And everybody's walking in, and they let 3 in, and everybody else just waits and everything. And of course, they're knocking down the gates and everything to get in to get this junk. But one of the things they notice is trouble in the checkout line. How do you pay now? I mean, if you have a new credit card that's got the chip on it, you tap it, you swipe it, you tap your phone, do you swipe your phone? And I just think that one of the things, I'm not sure this is the mark of the beast, but I think ultimately people will say, just for convenience, let's get rid of all that junk in our wallet and let's just get a chip. I mean, really, my wallet is so thick now that it's not money, it's plastic stuff. I can't put it in my back pocket anymore. I mean, I would look, well, it would be unsightly. And I couldn't sit on it, that's for sure. And so I've often thought, if it's a chip of some kind, when it comes, it'll be a good idea. Because people are tired of all the junk that they got to carry around. I don't have time to talk about the stuff going on campus. Maybe I'll talk about that this week. This is an interesting thing. There's a big company in China, went public last year, Alibaba, and what they're doing is they're tracking people, and like you get a credit score, China is now taking this data that they have on their citizens and they're giving them a good citizenship score. Okay? So, if you're going to a church, you get marked down for that if you're a Christian. If you know a Christian, you get marked down. This is what the great Chinese economic engine is doing with the data that they have. You think they're going to be the only one that tries to do this stuff? No. Now, I've talked a lot about this. I'm going to go through it relatively quickly today, but I think this is one aspect of the end times that a lot of people don't really talk about, and I think it's incredibly significant, and that is the demographic collapse that's taking place around the world, or the demographic shift. Europe is in a state of demographic collapse. If the United States did not allow large amount of immigration, we would be in a state of demographic collapse. And by that I mean is that our people, because of good health care, nutrition, cleaner water, they're living longer. I saw one stat where, in Central African Republic, 50 years ago, the average life expectancy was 30. It's now in the 70s. Well, when people live longer, guess what? There's more people around for longer. But when people live longer, you got to take care of them in their old age. They have more things go wrong with them. Trust me, I know. And this is what's happening all over the world. There's this huge demographic shift. Some of it has, I think, prophetic implications. For example, this is, I think these little numbers represent, I think it's 100,000 people. So in 1950, there were 2.5 billion people in the world. There were lots of people. The ones in white supported the children that are in orange and the elderly that are in blue. That's what 1950 was like. And then of that, there was a healthy number of women and girls in each age category. A little bit more women than men, usually about 105 to 100. today we have 7 billion people on the planet, and this is what the children, people of working age, and then the elderly. But each woman is having far fewer children, only about 2.5 each. Whereas opposed in the past, they had 5. So what's happened is populations have increased and continue to increase, but women are having fewer children. And every time a country develops, the birth rate goes down. Women get educated, they have fewer children. By 2050, they're saying that there will be 10 billion people on the planet. But only 13%, represented here, will be high-income countries. And the share of the elderly will grow quite a bit, but there will only be essentially these people to support all the others. It's a huge economic shift. For example, the article says this: mounting pensions are an important reason peripheral European countries like Greece have such intractable debt burdens, and why Germany is so reluctant to stimulate its own economy despite a balanced budget. Meanwhile, the movement of so many people into the highest saving period of their lives, older people save money and they don't spend as much, has produced a bulge of excess savings that has held down interest rates and inflation, making it difficult for central bankers to use their traditional tools to revive economic growth. This demographic shift has huge economic consequences, and this is unprecedented in human history. You need to understand that. And I'm just saying this is one more thing that you add to sort of the pile of things that are affecting geopolitics and economic issues here in the end times. It's part of this convergence that we've talked about. For example, here in Japan, in 2015, 6.4 dependents to 10 people of working age. But by 2050, just 35 years down the road, it'll be almost 1-to-1. Okay, so you think your Social Security taxes are high now? Same thing in China, the great economic engine. The number of dependents per worker is going to double in 35 years. The U.S., we're still protected because of the economic engine. China's workforce is dwindling. So what you used to be able to get cheap labor in China, the number of people that can work are going down. In this graphic, it shows each figure represents 100,000 women. If you count up all the girls who were never born because of selective abortion, victims of infanticide, and females who died from neglect, in 2050, the world will be missing 142 million women, mostly from China and India. In other words, 142 males with no prospect for marriage. Now, some people say that those numbers are underestimated, and the number, for example, when you look at a graph of where they are, you see that all other nations are a small chunk of this. Guess what? China and India account for close to 90% of the missing women and children. Why? Selective abortion, favoring males as children. So by some estimates, again, some say this is by 2050 it'll be 120 million. It's going to peak here in the next few years. Some people say the number is not really 120 million missing males in China and India, it's 200 million. Now, does that number ring a bell with you in Bible prophecy? I mean, what's going to happen with 200 million males with no spouse? What are you going to do? Maybe make a big army and take them out? So, but as the marriage squeeze worsens, the Wall Street says this, as the marriage squeeze worsens in the next few decades, no amount of bride migration will be able to stem the shortfall, demographers say. The problem will intensify radically in the next 5 years and become explosive in the next decade, said Nicholas Eberstadt, a political economist and demographer at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, who studies sex ratios. If the masculine sex ratios remain as high, in China there would be as many as 186 single men for every 100 single women hoping to marry by mid-century. By 2060 in India, the peak could be higher, 191 men for each woman. And at the same time that this is happening, there is this shift. This is a shift in the birth rates that you're going to see from 1950 to 2055 or so. And the darker the country, the higher the birth rate. So you see where the birth rates are high right now. They're relatively, Russia, US, Canada, all the developed countries, the birth rates are relatively low. And so here's a graph of what happens with the shift in population. You see this massive growth in the population of Asia, and then you will see this explosion in Africa, where by 2055, the birth rates in Africa will be the only ones that will be anywhere what they were approaching. Interesting statistics in this article, Lagos, Nigeria, the largest city in Nigeria. In 1960, its population was 180,000. What do you think the population of Lagos, Nigeria is today? 21 million in 50 years. 180,000 to 21 million. And there are many cities like this. In the around 1950 or so, there was only one city in Africa that had over 1 million people. It was Cairo. And now there are dozens. A lot. I mean, you don't even hear of these cities. It's like our friend in China tells us that you go out to the village, and a village in China has 500,000 or 700,000 people. That's a city here in America. But you see how all this thing will happen, and a lot of this pays off in migration that we see going on right now, because European countries and America have brought in people to shore up their population declines. That has a huge cultural, economic impact. In The Spectator, this is from back in April, gunboats are the humanitarian answer to Libya's refugee crisis. This is when they were just coming in from Libya. And he said this, Rob Little, in The Spectator in England wrote this: "Here's the deal. There are two ways in which we can act to prevent future boatloads of migrants from drowning in the Mediterranean. Only two ways. Let them all in or stop them from trying to come. Letting them all in would certainly save more lives in the short term. I think it would cause a few problems. Million upon million upon million of people would come, and by tea time." Now, this is back in April, before the Syrian thing even really started. By tea time on day one, the countries of Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and most of the Sahel would be virtually deserted, just the occasional black flag left waving in the desert breeze. I don't think we want that. But if they do want that, they should say so. Think about how we might deal with the consequences. And then back in June, Victor Davis Hanson, professor at the war historian at Stanford University, really one of the great minds, wrote this article on June 4th, 2015, just 5 months ago, 6 months ago. What's driving the influx of migrants and refugees to the West? He wrote from Tuscany. He was there on vacation, apparently. Northern and Central Italy are not on the southern Mediterranean, but somehow thousands of refugees from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East are everywhere here, as is true of much of the European Union. Some sleep on park benches, many peddle knockoff electronic goods and counterfeit watches. Angry Italians shoo away refugee beggars from tour groups. And he goes on to talk about the Greek islands near the coast of Turkey are likewise flooded this summer with dispossessed refugees from countries such as Afghanistan and Syria. Apparently, a bankrupt Greek government lacks the resources to patrol its vast coastline. Some beleaguered Greeks assume that the thousands of boat people and homeless refugees will eventually leave their makeshift camps and head northward to the wealthier homelands of Greece's northern European creditors. A similar rush has overwhelmed the American southern border. In the last 2 years, tens of thousands of Central American and Mexican citizens have sensed that the Obama administration has suspended border enforcement. Illegal entry into the United States won't result in punishment, but instead an array of social services unimaginable in Latin America. And then he goes on, in an article he just wrote this past week, what's going to happen in the last year of the Obama administration? And his conclusion is, Obama has just begun. He says this: Obama certainly has doubled down going into his last year, most recently insisting on letting more refugees from the Middle East at a time when the children of Middle Eastern immigrants and contemporary migrants are terrorizing Europe. What remaining unpopular executive acts might anger his opponents the most? Close down Guantanamo, let thousands more refugees in the United States, free thousands more felons, snub another ally, flatter away another enemy. Do you understand what Victor Davis Hanson is saying? This person is a destroyer of what was America. Extend amnesty to another million illegal aliens, make global warming laws by fiat, expand Obamacare, unilaterally impose gun control. In lieu of achievement, is the Obama theory to become relevant or noteworthy by offending the public and goading political enemies? The hordes of young male migrants abandoning the Middle East for the West are merely analogous to the past waves of migrants and should be uniformly welcome. For Obama, there is no connection between them and his slashing of American involvement in the Middle East, much less any sense of responsibility that his own actions helped produce the crisis he now fobs off on others. And he goes on, he just says, what's happening is just this incredible thing. Few foresaw this critical element of the Obama character. The tiny number of prescient pundits who warned that Obama years would entail were not the supposedly sober and judicious establishment voices who, in fact, seemed to be caught up in the hope and change euphoria and missed entirely Obama's petulance and pick. And he goes through and he reviews what some of the people said, the Evan Thomases. He's sort of God. Or the David Brookses. And I was looking at his pant leg and his perfectly creased pant, and I'm thinking, he's going to be a president, and he'll be a very good president. It's easy to sketch out a scenario in which Obama could be a great president. Or the Chris Matthews, the feeling most people get when they hear Barack Obama's speech. I felt this thrill going up my leg. I mean, I don't have those too often. Or the Michael Beschlosses. I would say he's probably the smartest guy ever to become president. Or the Chris Buckleys, a conservative. He has exhibited throughout a first-class temperament. Or the Kathleen Parkers, with solemn prayers that Obama will govern as the centrist, pragmatic leader he is capable of being. I saw that head explode back there. Or the Peggy Noonans, former speechwriter for Republican administration. He has within him the possibility to change the direction and tone of American foreign policy, which need changing. His rise will serve as a practical rebuke to the past 5 years, which need rebuking. His victory would provide a fresh start in a nation in which a fresh start would come as a national relief. In truth, it was the loud, sometimes shrill and caricatured voices of talk radio, the so-called crazy Republican House members, and the grassroots loudmouths of what would become the Tea Party who had Obama's number. They warned early on that Barack Obama's record was that of a petulant extremist, that he would borrow and spend like no other president, that he would use his community organizing skills cynically to divide Americans along racial lines, that nothing in the past had ever suggested anything other than radicalism and an ease with divisive speech. They an instinctual dislike of the entrepreneur and self-made businessman. Down a little further, that he would render immigration law null and void, that he would diminish the profile of America abroad, and that he would do all this because he was an ideologue with no history of bipartisanship, but a lot of animus towards his critics, and one who saw no ethical or practical reason to appreciate the more than 60 years of America's post-war global leadership and the world that it had built. Again, the despised right-wingers were right, and the more modern establishment was wrong. And now he goes on to say, Russia, China, Hezbollah, North Korea, ISIS, they're thinking, if we have a chance at this, we might as well take advantage of it in the next 14 months. The more contrarian he becomes, the more he opposes the wishes of the vast majority of American people, all the more Obama envisions himself as speaking truth to power and becoming iconic of something rather than the reality that is becoming a proof of nothing. Hold on, we haven't seen anything yet. Now, one of the areas is in immigration. This is a big controversy among Christians right now. What do we do? Do we let them in? Do we keep them out? There's a guy, his name is... I'll give you the name. It's on the bottom of my next slide. I want to play a video clip of what he does with gumballs to show what the impact of allowing 1 million immigrants into the United States has on the worldwide economic situation and economy. I'm going to pick up in the middle of the talk. He's got gumballs that represent the world population. They're tubes and everything. So I'm going to say, okay, this is what happens when you let 1 million in. And you'll see 1 million is represented by one gumball.
The impossibility of making even a dent is actually worse than it looks here. Because last year, when we took 1 million immigrants, these countries added, births over deaths, 80 million more people into the impoverished populations. And this year, Congress is bringing in 1 million legal immigrants. And this year, according to the United Nations, these countries are expected to add another 80 million people. And next year, you can be quite sure that Congress, unless stopped by the American voters, will bring in another 1 million immigrants. And these countries, unfortunately, will be adding another 80 million people into these impoverished nations. We could take 5 million a year, but we'd never get ahead of what's happening in these countries. Not in this century. Don't you see? Immigration can never be an effective or significant way to deal with the suffering people of the world. They have to be helped where they live. 99.9% of them will never be able to immigrate to a rich country. There's no hope for that. They have to bloom where they're planted. The only place that 99.9% of these people can be helped is where they live. Let's help them there.
And next.
Now I'm going to, so you see, it's, somebody mentioned somebody this week who was saying something, and they referred to him as uneducated. I cannot remember who it was. It's a very liberal person. Oh, I know what it was. I don't even have the slide. Shane Claiborne. Oh, you know who Shane Claiborne is? Very popular, emergent, evangelical guy from Philadelphia, spoken at Grace Brethren National Youth Conference, spoken at Grace College Chapel, speaks at all these evangelical things. He's a peace activist, and he says, you know, white people are the problem. Now, he's white himself, has dreadlocks, that type of thing, lives in the inner city of Philadelphia. White people are the problem. And he cites this NBC study that says, oh, there are more white terrorists than, you know, Muslim terrorists in the world. Well, they take one statistic and they look at that statistic. But when you look at the terrorist acts, you know, white people here, Muslim terrorists, radical Islamists here. There's no comparison in terms of numbers in the United States. But he's, you know, he believes it because, so he said he must be uneducated. He's not uneducated. He's highly educated. That's the problem. You have to be highly educated. You have to go to a leftist religious institution, a seminary called the university, and you have to have the common sense beat out of you. And this is, and you see the stuff that's going on with the students and stuff. This is Orwellian, the stuff that they're doing. It's crazy. And what these people are in college and they're saying this. What happens when they get out in the world, in the workplaces? And so the only conclusion you can come to is, absent an immediate sudden revival, we're toast. It's the end times. That's what we've been saying all along, and we need to be prepared for it. But the president says, look, we're going to do something that's going to be, well, you'll hear what he says about ISIS and the terrorist attack in France. This is a joint news conference this week at the White House with the president of France.
And next week, I will be joining President Hollande and world leaders in Paris for the Global Climate Conference. What a powerful rebuke to the terrorists it will be when the world stands as one and shows that we will not be deterred from building a better future for our children.
Well, I bet the ISIS guys is just wet their pants, you know. I'm not sure if it was from excitement or it certainly wasn't from dread. Article in the Wall Street why this could happen. this article the other day by Caroline Glick in the Jerusalem Post talks about Obama's new counterterrorism guru. Really? Who is he? Well, I went back and I dug out the Democratic debate, and don't have a long clip, but I think you need to listen to this, because now they have ads touting what was said in this debate to rebuke the Republicans, to say we need to fight radical Islamism. We need to take the fight to them. And so first you're going to hear Bernie Sanders do something that I think is unusual for a Democrat. So Bernie Sanders and then that other person who's running.
And that is, we have to understand that the Muslim nations in the region, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Jordan, all of these nations, they're going to have to get their hands dirty, their boots on the ground. They are going to have to take on ISIS. This is a war for the soul of Islam. And
now, I thought it wasn't about the religion, but he said it is. He must not have got, it's always interesting in these debates because people, they don't remember the talking points. Every now and then reality kind of away. So here's here Hillary Clinton identifies the new counterterrorism guru that the Democrats are looking to.
The Libyans turned out for one of the most successful, fairest elections that any Arab country has had. They elected moderate leaders.
Secretary Clinton, you mentioned radical jihadists.
Yes.
Marco Rubio, also running for president, said that this attack showed, and the attack in Paris showed, that we are at war with radical Islam. Do you agree with that characterization, radical Islam?
I don't think we're at war with Islam. I don't think we're at war with all Muslims. I think we're...
Do you see how she twists the words? Please, people, wake up.
We're at war with jihadists who have...
Just to interrupt, he didn't say all Muslims. He just said radical Islam. Is that a phrase you don't...
I think that you can talk about Islamists who clearly are also jihadists, but I think it's not particularly helpful to make the case that Senator Sanders was just making, that I agree with, that we've got to reach out to Muslim countries, we've got to have them be part of our coalition. If they hear people running for president who basically shortcut it to say we are somehow against Islam, that was one of the real contributions, despite all the other problems, that George W. Bush made after 9/11, when he basically said, after going to a mosque in Washington, we are not at war with Islam or Muslims. We are at war with violent extremism. We are at war with people who use their religion for purposes of power and oppression. And yes, we are at war with those people, but I don't want us to be painting with too broad a brush.
Okay. But the Republicans, I'll paint with them with a broad brush about things they never even said. Caroline Glick says this: since the Islamic State attacks in Paris on November 13, we have seen the development of a new and strange justification for the Obama administration's insistent refusal to jettison its manifestly failed strategy of contending with IS specifically and with Islamic terrorism generally. And so now we have the new guru for counterterrorism in the Democratic Party is George W. Bush, or Bush 43. Now, I had a lot of problems with George, and I think if you ask most people on the conservative side, they have a lot of problems with the way George Bush handled that and what he said. In fact, they hate it. They don't like it at all. So what do we have now? A global travel alert. Americans, I guess you're not supposed to go anywhere. Or be careful if you go anywhere. Migration crisis could push the UK out of Europe. This thing, Obama's still pushing immigration. We have the thing going on in Syria. This is Kobani, where the Islamic State ruled, and now it's been taken back. Great. We get to move back home. Oh. And this is the thing all over Syria. And so I want you to remember this map. This is from the Institute of Study of War. And you see the area here in gray that was controlled by the Islamic State. You have the Kurds up here. They've taken back Sinjar. They've taken back Kobani. The Islamic State still controls this. There's a lot of things going on. Is the Erdogan government involved in the oil smuggling? There's some pretty good evidence that it was. And And then you have the government forces in control over here. You have the rebels. You have Hezbollah in kind of a mix here. And you have this down here into the Golan. You have Hezbollah and other things right there on the border of Israel. I want you to remember that map about what's going on in the Golan, because we're going to see something in just a minute. Of course, here was this confrontation that took place. Turkey shot down a Russian jet fighter that it said had intruded on its airspace. Putin has come down on this with like a ton of bricks on the Turkish armed forces of the Turkish allies within Syria, bombing them to pieces. You see the plane crash here, and the pilot apparently was shot as he was coming down in his parachute and killed. I'm not sure what happened to the other one. The rescue helicopter was also shot down using American-made missiles, is my understanding. There's a dispute with Russia and Turkey as to what happened. Turkish radar says that it did go up across this little section of Turkey right here. Russian radar says no, it was here the whole time, and they've put economic sanctions in place. Now Erdogan is sounding very conciliatory this morning. The other thing that's happened is Russia has moved a number of these S-400 missile batteries into Syria and essentially has turned Syria into a no-fly zone. That includes American military flights. Israel's made some incursions into that area, but they've got cooperation with Russia. We have this Area C. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. My slides are a little bit out of order. Oh, here's Shane Claiborne. This is where American evangelicals are. Study finds white Americans, this is his tweet. I copied it off his Twitter page. Study finds white Americans are biggest threat to national security. Based on an MSNBC study, white Americans are the biggest terror threat in the United States. Study shows. So you dig down into the report, and this is in the MSNBC report. So it's apparently the headline reader didn't read the report. Here's the jihadist attacks. The jihadist attacks are the gray ones. Non-jihadist are these over years. And you see, like in recent history, non-jihadist, jihadist. So, and then you look at the number of attacks, and what you'll find is the victims killed by right-wing extremists, or what they identify as right-wing extremists, were higher. That's the only thing where was higher was the number of victims killed, but the number of attacks were about double on the jihadist side. And this is Obama's thing about, of course, we're gonna talk about climate change. We're gonna rebuke them. And here's Ramirez's cartoon. And suddenly the president realized that ISIS was the threat. Another article in Investors Business Daily, editorial page is the Nazi dream coming true. It says this: with synagogues closed for fear of terrorism, Brussels chief rabbi warns of no future for Jews in Europe. 70 years after the Nazis' defeat, their dream of a Jew-free Europe is revived. The 1944 Nazi pamphlet, The Jew as World Parasite, declares, we National Socialists believe the Fuhrer when he says that at the end of the battle, unleashed on us as his strongest adversary by the Jewish world parasite, the Jewish race in Europe will be destroyed. And now they're saying, yep, we need to take out these people. I don't have time to go into this, just briefly so you know. In Minneapolis and in some other places, for example, there was a man who put up a float in a parade, and in the float, he had himself in bib overalls, standing with his walker. It was a caricature of himself, paper mache, next to an outhouse, and on the outhouse he said, Obama's foreign policy. a group, a rather secretive group, that seems to appear at all of these racial incidents from the Department of Justice showed up and questioned him about that. This is happening all over America. It's happening in Baltimore. It's happening in Ferguson and other places. This group shows up. They're called something conciliators to achieve racial harmony, but when they're interviewed, they don't say anything. And they're from the Justice Department. So I think, remember we talked about the Strong Cities Network? You need to, if you're vocal about these things, you need to be ready to record things. You understand what I'm saying? So you have a record of what was said. In the shooting in Colorado Springs the other day, I just saw this. It kind of struck me as it was a sheriff vehicle shows up. Sheriff's vehicle. That's an armored tank. Now, a lot of people are upset about that, and the Obama administration is taking them away, and now people are upset about that because we need them now. So, it's sort of a catch-22. We want to be safe, but we don't want to be oppressed. And so, because of the way the situation of the world, and a lot of this migration stuff, folks, I personally believe it is by design, it is a plan, and somebody or somebodies are funding it. Because there's no way this amount of people can traverse across that much territory. Just like remember we talked about this, 50,000 children walked from Central America to the border in America? Now look. You may not believe, I actually walked over 10 miles a couple times in my life. And I thought I was going to die. Now you're going to tell me that they walked 10 miles increments for 1,800 miles with no help, no food, no parents. Folks, you are stretching my ability to believe you if you say this was all spontaneous. Now this, just close with a couple more things here. The JCPOA. This is the Iran nuke deal. And this was a timeline that was laid out by the Obama administration as to what was going to happen with this deal. Remember, he set it up so he could get it through Congress really without majority approval, and a lot of the Republicans went along, and he said, oh, this is great, everybody's in agreement. Guess what? Here's the problem. One of the congressmen wrote a letter to the State Department. Mike Pompeo, a Republican congressman from Kansas, wrote a letter to the Secretary of State, John Kerry, and said, Mr. Kerry, Secretary Kerry, did Iran ever sign this thing? Now, you were led to believe, right? Everything's fine, they signed it, they agreed to it. Not according to the State Department. The response letter came back. Here's a PDF copy of it. And the letter says this, and I quote, "The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is not a treaty or an executive agreement and is not a signed document." The success of the JCPOA will depend not on whether it is legally binding or signed, but rather on the extensive verification measures we have put in place, as well as Iran's understanding that we have the capacity to reimpose and ramp up our sanctions if Iran does not meet its commitments. The success of the JCPOA will depend not on whether it is legally binding or signed. Well, that's comforting. That's very comforting. Here is But I want to, I think, finish up with just some things going on with Israel, because we know that Israel really is the focus. The world will turn against Israel. So here is a report from Israel. UN adopts resolution demanding Israel return populated territory to Syria. So I went over to UN Watch, and they have the resolutions there. You can go read them for yourself, unwatch.org. And here it is, the General Assembly. And they're going to say the Syrian Golan. Now remember what I said. Remember, you saw the Islamic State, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, right there on the border of Israel along the Golan. So the UN is on it. Okay, they have a resolution now that they adopted 6 resolutions this week regarding Israel. How many did they adopt about China, Russia, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Libya, Jordan? 0. 6 for Israel because they're the problem. So here's what the Syrian Golan resolution says. The Syrian Golan, the General Assembly, having considered the item entitled The Situation in the Middle East, taking note of the report of the Secretary General on the situation in the Middle East, recalling Security Council Resolution 497, goes on, reaffirming the fundamental principle of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force in accordance with international law and the Charter of the United Nations. They're referencing what? The Six-Day War in 1967, almost 50 years ago. Deeply concerned that Israel has not withdrawn. They're deeply concerned about this. I mean, I've been to the Golan a couple times. It's actually kind of neat. It's kind of a beautiful place, and probably the most, at least from my standpoint, I'm not a trained military historian or anything, one of the most militarily strategic pieces of real estate on planet Earth. It is the high ground. You give that up and there'll be bombing. There'll be raining shells down on the Israelis living down along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, just like they were before the 67 war. Hasn't happened since. Everything's been fine. You go up there, it's very peaceful. Pastoral farms, great historic sites, Tsreen and Tel Dan and everything. It's a wonderful area. Deeply concerned that Israel has not withdrawn from the Syrian Golan, which has been under occupation since 1967, contrary to the relevant Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. They go on to say this, noting with satisfaction the convening in Madrid on 30 October 1991 of the Peace Conference on the Middle East on the basis of Security Council resolutions 242, 338, and 425, and the formula of land for peace. That was the Madrid Conference. You've heard Bill Caney talk about that. The Madrid Conference in 1991 that George Bush 41, went to. And while he was at that conference talking about forcing Israel to give up land for peace, what happened? Remember The Perfect Storm, the movie The Perfect Storm? Cold water hurricane, one of the most unusual storms in history. It moved backwards, and it almost destroyed the Bush residence at Kennebunkport, Maine. While he was in Madrid, at the conference, talking about giving up land for peace. Just a coincidence, I'm sure. Expressing grave concern, this is the UN General Assembly, expressing grave concern over the halt in the peace process on the Syrian track, and expressing the hope that peace talks will soon resume from the point they had reached. Now, my question, if I was questioning a UN person, I would say, the peace talks on the Syrian track, who do you talk to? The country has fallen apart. In fact, this report, just in the Times of Israel yesterday, Syria is dead. Better tell the UN. Israel must prepare, top defense official says. The nation state of Syria has collapsed, a fact that Israel must internalize about its northern neighbor, a senior Israeli defense official said Saturday. Syria is a dead state, and Israel must understand this and prepare accordingly. Amos Gilad, the director of the Political Security Division and the Defense Ministry, and a former military intelligence official, told a cultural event in Beersheba. Syrian President Bashar Assad's grip on the country is faltering and is a land without rule. But to the UN, we're upset that you're not negotiating with nobody. You see Bible prophecy unfolding right in front of your eyes. The world turning against Israel. And remember, we talk about the end-time deception, the fog of deception that descends. People will follow this evil world ruler and think it's great because they're deceived. They're deceived now. Do you think it's going to be any problem for some guy to come in and deceive them further? And to the faithful believing church, we look at this stuff, we should look at this stuff and say, this doesn't make any sense. And the only way you can make sense is to say, yeah, they are deceived. And Jesus warned about that more than anything else. Determines once more that the continuing occupation of the Syrian Golan and its de facto annexation constitute a stumbling block in the way of achieving a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace in the region. Yeah, like that's the problem over there right now, really. Yeah, the Golan, yeah, that's the problem. Calls upon Israel to resume talks in the Syrian and Lebanese tracts and to respect the commitments and undertakings reached during the previous talks. See, this is why I think Oslo is important, because what they're pointing out here is that Oslo, they want to go back to Oslo. Oslo 1 and Oslo 2, where Israel made a commitment to give up land for peace. Demands once more that Syria withdrawn from all the occupied Syrian Golan line to the line of 4 June 1967, an implementation of the relevant Security Council measures. Well, they weren't done. They also have this: Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, another resolution adopted this week by the UN, reaffirming that the United Nations has a permanent responsibility towards the question of Palestine. Now listen, Europe is being invaded, the Middle East is falling apart, and this is what concerns the UN? Do you understand how far down the deception path the world has gone? It's down the rabbit hole, so to speak. And at this point, I don't see it coming back, folks. I really don't. I just don't see how. Do you think anybody in our administration right now, our executive branch, has a clue? We're going to rebuke them with a climate change meeting. That'll show them. Requests the committee to continue to exert all efforts to promote the realization of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, including their right to self-determination, to support the achievement without delay of an end to the Israeli occupation that began in 1967, and of the two-state solution on the basis of the pre-1967 borders. Further requests the committee to continue to extend its cooperation and support to Palestinian and other civil society organizations, and to continue to involve additional civil society organizations and parliamentarians in its work in order to mobilize. Somebody go home and diagram that sentence for me, okay? You'll need a really wide spreadsheet. In its work in order to mobilize international solidarity and support for the Palestinian people, particularly during this critical period of political instability, humanitarian hardship, and financial crisis. Yes, it is bad. It's so bad that CNN put this up in a report on what's going on in the Middle East, and they had Palestine, but they didn't have Israel. So they were called on it, and now they have this picture there instead. Well, here's another one. Peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine. Reaffirming the principle, there's another resolution. Reaffirming the principle of inadmissibility of acquisition of territory. War, expressing grave concern also about all acts of violence, intimidation, and provocation by Israeli settlers against Palestinian civilians, including children, and properties, including homes, mosques, churches, and agricultural lands. By the way, I'll tell you what. Go find me a Jewish person in Gaza, okay? Go find me one, and we'll talk. Condemning acts of terror by several extremist Israeli settlers. And yet here's this. A young man buried in Israel. With a knife in his heart, my son shot the terrorist. An 18-year-old laid to rest in Jerusalem yesterday. Palestinian kills soldier in Route 443 stabbing. Jerusalem Post. Teenage girl terrorist. Look at the other headline there. Teenage girl terrorist attacked elderly Palestinian man in Jerusalem by mistake, stabbing him with scissors. Here's Reuters. Says this. This is the headline on Reuters, one of the great news services of the world. I'm sure they have an unbiased opinion. Palestinian dies in ramming attack. He was doing the ramming. He was the terrorist. this stuff, you may let your heads explode now. Reaffirming the illegality of Israeli actions aimed at changing the status of Jerusalem, including settlement construction and expansion, home demolitions, evictions of Palestinian residents, excavations. And it's not, listen, you can go through this page after page of every one of these resolutions, and guess what? Stabbings in Jerusalem of Jews, nothing, not even a word, not a word. There's some talk Israel may go ahead and annex this area to the south and east of Jerusalem. It's in Area C, I believe. It's something that they're going to take anyway. And there's talk that they may just do this as a test, as sort of a rebuke to all the stuff that's going on. The UN continued expressing its grave concern, in particular about tension. This stuff goes on for page after page after page. Expressing its grave concern, in particular about tensions, provocations, and incitement regarding the holy places of Jerusalem, including the Haram al-Sharif, and urging restraint and respect for the sanctity of the holy sites of all sides. Reaffirming that the construction by Israel, the occupying power of a wall in the occupied Palestinian territory, including in and around Jerusalem, are contrary to international law. They did that to stop the sniper attacks. And you don't hear about that, right? You might go check out the Gatestone Institute. This is a pretty good article about the real goal of the Intifada, and I think we are in another Intifada. It's a different one than they've seen before. Here's more. This is the UN resolution on Israel. It says this: having considered the report of the Secretary General, I'd love to see what this guy's telling these people. Ban Ki-moon reiterates its determination that any actions taken by Israel, the occupying power, to impose its law, jurisdiction, and administration on the holy city of Jerusalem are illegal and therefore null and void and have no validity whatsoever. Calls for respect for the historic status quo at the holy places of Jerusalem, including the Haram al-Sharif, in word and practice, and urges all sides to work immediately and cooperatively to diffuse tensions and halt all provocations, incitement, and violence at the holy sites in the city. And then this, I'll close with this as I'm over. Big surprise, huh? Israeli ministers hold a marathon meetings on the possibility of the Palestinian Authority's collapse. They had this meeting. Prime Minister Netanyahu convened the meeting after Tuesday's visit by U.S. Secretary of State. After Tuesday's visit by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry failed to achieve any progress on the Palestinian front. The senior official, who asked to remain anonymous, said Netanyahu called the meeting because information had reached Jerusalem that the Palestinian Authority was planning new steps against Israel in the international arena in light of Kerry's failure to obtain any Israeli concessions. One move the PA is considering, the official said, is presenting a resolution in either the UN Security Council or the General Assembly, the latter a venue where the United States lacks a veto, demanding international protection for Palestinians in the occupied state of Palestine. A more extreme step being considered is revoking the PLO's 1993 decision to recognize Israel, a decision that formed the basis for the Oslo Accords. We've talked a lot about that. So what you're going to see is you're going to see this push by the world, and right now I think this Oslo Accord thing is a very important thing in the timeline of Bible prophecy, because it may be the covenant that the world, somebody steps forward to say, look, I'm going to make this secure, I'm going to make this stronger, which is the words used in Daniel chapter 9. I think it very well may be that. Don't say, John said this is what's exactly going to happen. I'm just saying as I look at the geopolitical landscape and I look for a covenant, which I know is out there, floating around someplace, I'm looking at the Oslo Accords. Remember, we played the video clips of the signing of that in here a few weeks ago. I think that may be it. And the Haaretz article says this: all three sources said the possibility of the Palestinian Authority collapsing arose in the context of the ministers' discussion about how Israel should deal with such steps mooted by the Palestinian Authority. The discussion focused on the possibility that Israeli military pressure, the economic crisis in Abbas's eroding legitimacy among Palestinians, could combine to cause the Palestinian Authority's collapse. Senior Israeli defense forces and Shin Bet security service officers are very worried by the possibility of the PA collapsing and warn the ministers of the consequences for both security and civilian affairs. So all I'm saying is this, is that the whole situation seems to be inviting someone to come in and solve the crisis. That's what I'm saying. And I don't have time. What I want you to do this week, there's a great prophecy passage. It lays out the pattern for what's going to happen. It talks about the Jewish people. It's a conversation between Moses and the Lord about the Jews. It's in Numbers chapter 14. Go read that passage this week. I will try to talk about it next week and put it into context, because I think it has a beautiful picture of what's going to happen to the Jewish people. You know, it talks about, what am I going to do with these people? Moses says, God, like in Ezekiel 36, God reaches in and draws them back into the land. Why? Because they're so perfect and they deserve it? Nope. Because his name is at stake. Because until they're back there, the ultimate final redemption of mankind and the millennial kingdom cannot take place. It is a critical component of Bible prophecy. I will admit, they don't deserve it. But God said he made a covenant with them about that land. And it's permanent, it's forever, and he's going to fulfill it. And we see it unfolding for that fulfillment in our lifetime. So let's pray. Father, Lord, I just pray that you'll watch over us this week. Lord, I pray that you would seal us, protect us with your Holy Spirit, give us the right things to say, the right things to do. And Lord, I know that there are brothers and sisters in the Lord that are really under attack for the stance that they take. Lord, I pray that you would intervene miraculously and correct that situation. And I pray, Lord, that you will help us to keep in mind that we need to be in your word, living holy lives, and relying on you for everything in our life. Thank you so much, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.